All right, welcome to the history lesson for March 18th. Yesterday we were discussing the beginnings of World War I. We talked about the first events on the Western Front of both 1914 and 1915, the Battle of the Frontiers and the First Battle of the Marne. We talked about how deadly they were, how destructive they were, and how quickly everything settled down to a stalemate on the Western Front. Both sides dug trenches, both sides essentially established battle lines that were not going to be moved. It was just a slow and deadly slog. By this time, Belgium had been taken over by Germany, and because of that, Belgium was now in a hard place. Germany was ruling cruelly, and that was shaping opinion all over Europe. But the West was largely locked up. Now let's turn our attention to the East. So back in the East, the Eastern Front, and that is the border between Germany and its allies, who were the Central Powers, and Russia, who was part of the Triple Entente. So back in the Eastern Front, Russia surprised everyone. Remember, the German Schlieffen Plan was based upon how slowly Russia would be able to mobilize, how slowly Russia would be able to gather its armies together into a coherent unit. And everything had been built with that in mind. And the understanding was Russia would be slow, and in the meantime, Germany would be able to invade and potentially destroy France, and then, after doing this, turn their attention to Russia. Well, Russia surprised everyone. Russia mobilized rather quickly. And after mobilizing, it immediately went on the offensive. And not only did it go on the offensive, because the Germans had left very few troops in the East, and the troops that they had left had been, in some ways, inferior. They're second-class troops. The Russians had won several key victories, and this was turning into a real concern. So this stops with the arrival of General Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg was an interesting fellow. Paul von Hindenburg was a German general. He had spent his entire life, his entire career as a military man. He had fought all the way back in the Franco-Prussian War, back when he was just a soldier. He had slowly been promoted through the ranks. He had risen to the rank of lieutenant general within the German army, and then in the early 1900s he retired. It was his time. He had been passed over for supreme command of the German staff, and seemed like a good point to call it a career. In World War I, and suddenly this need for new commands, for experienced leaders, he gets called back up into service. He was not the first commander of the Eastern Front. The first commander of the Eastern Front had largely failed. And so von Hindenburg is given control of the Eastern Front, and his assistant, his chief of staff, was General Erich von Ludendorff. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are going to become major players in World War I. In fact, two of the most important names on the German side. But this was their beginning. Their beginning was fighting on the Russian front, the Eastern Front. So quickly, he organizes a defense. It was a wise defense. He pulled back. He allowed his central line to be pushed, and then he outflanked the Russians. He basically surrounded them and destroyed them. I believe he took 92,000 Russian prisoners. It was probably the single largest victory in World War I. Because by this time both sides were just locked into stalemates, and this was a genuine advance. So he surrounds and destroys the Russian army. This led the German armies to be able to make some advances. They won repeated victories. It was abundantly obvious very quickly that other than Germany, the Central Powers were largely incompetent. Austria and Hungary and the Ottoman Empire just did not have the capability to fight on the level that Germany did. But on the flip side, it was also abundantly obvious that really Russia was not in the same league, was not qualified to be counted among the great powers the way that Germany was. And so Germany was making some significant advances along the Eastern Front. This is a picture of General Paul von Hindenburg, excuse me. Older man. He was a man of imposing stature, 6'5". He was everything you would expect from a Prussian general. He looked the part. He acted the part. Now, a lot of the creativity of his command probably came out of Ludendorff and his staff, but Hindenburg was the one he had a strong belief, a very traditional belief, that the senior general would give an outline of what was to be done, and then his subordinates were to work out the details. And he had a good idea of his outlines, and Ludendorff was very good at working out details. And together they were a dynamic team, a successful team, and they led Germany to significant advances along the Eastern Front. And this shuts down the Russian advances, it shores up the German backside line, and it provides, for propaganda's sake, a number of important victories that allow the German people to really think that they have a chance of winning this and encourage them to continue to go on. Now, by 1915, we're in the second year of the war. Remember, the war itself begins in the middle of 1914. But by 1915, it was obvious that German superiority in leadership, tactics, firepower, and technology meant that they could advance in the east, but the west was going to remain bogged down. So Germany was not going to be able to make much advances in the Western Front, just because the French and the British were fairly evenly matched when it came to the Germans. But in the east, they were a significant step ahead of the Russians. And so this is going to give them a real direction. It allows them to continue to push hard in Russia. So Germany goes on the offensive, and Russia was in serious trouble. Keep in mind, from a strategic perspective, if Germany was able to destroy Russia, then Germany could take all the troops that were currently on the Eastern Front and send them to the Western Front, in which case they would have a vast numerical superiority over the British and the French, in which case they could launch an offensive and potentially win the war. So the fact that Russia was still fighting was crucial to the Triple Entente, but that becomes a harder and harder task to manage because Russia is just so outclassed. Germany goes in the offensive, Russia is in serious trouble. Russia did what Russia has always done when it comes time to fighting. Throw more men at the problem. So Russia, rather than developing new tactics, although they tried, Russia, rather than developing new technology, although they did try, Russia's advantage has always been they had millions and millions of young men who they could arm and throw into the fight as cannon fodder, as meat shields. And it is a vicious cycle, but it was one that had served Russia well in the past and was going to serve them well in the future. Eventually, just by weight of the numbers, the Russians were able to stabilize the line. And so just like in the West, the East became a stalemate. Movement stopped. And there was a clear line of division. One side was German and one side was Russian. Now, the problem is that the Germans had taken quite a bit of territory from the Russians, including valuable territory that contained necessary natural resources and people that were crucial to the Russian Empire. And Russia, unlike Germany at this point, could not point to success. And keep in mind with how badly the Russian political system had been shaken before the war. There was the 1905 revolution. There was the unpopularity of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. There was the general feeling of his own incompetence. Russia couldn't afford this stalemate. For every year of stalemate, and every year of stalemate would result in further famine, further denial of basic goods to Russia. Russia was in a race for time. The longer this war went, the more their people would begin to be frustrated and to take out their frustrations on the Tsar and on his leadership. Germany had more flexibility when it came to this. And so that's going to be a real problem for Russia. But for the time being, 1915, the line is at least stabilized. And for a moment, it looks like the Russians are able to hold. To give you an idea of just the significance, as town after town became battlefields, as the Germans advanced before the Russians were able to stabilize, every village, every city, every town, it became a mini battleground. And because of the advent of artillery, not just the old cannon fire, but this time artillery shells that were explosive, that were armor penetrating, basically what you have here is you have every building becomes a fort, but they could not survive the onslaught of artillery. And so town after town was utterly destroyed. You can see the uniqueness of this combination. We see three different modes of transportation here that were all important to the war effort. You have the Germans, and they're using automobiles. No surprise there. These trucks were effective so long as the roads weren't bogged down by mud. They were useful. You have horses, also useful, but you also have bicycles. It was a strange transition. The world is becoming more technologically advanced, but it's not there yet. There is still work to be done. The things that are familiar to us were just becoming, well, common. And so it was basically whatever you have, use it to the best of your ability, especially in Russia because of the advent of winter, because of the road systems becoming absolute sludge. Once the rains came, horses still had a valuable role to play. In fact, a more valuable role than trucks did at this time, but it was the beginning of something new. 1915, war was a stalemate. No side is moving, both sides are still assaulting each other, both sides are trying to find some advantage, but neither side having much luck. Neither side was strong enough to overwhelm the other, but neither side was weak enough to obviously surrender and thus end the war. So both sides are searching for some sort of advantage that would allow them to seize the initiative, to overwhelm the other, to end at least one of the fronts, and then devote all their resources to the remaining front. The war was a battle of attrition, and by attrition I mean a race to see who could kill more of the other troops. So in the early days, the war was a battle of territory, who could possess the most land. But now with the advent of the trenches and with the stabilization of the lines, it wasn't about land. Everyone knew you weren't going to take more than a mile at best. The real trick was how many of the other side you could kill. That's the idea of attrition. So old men sent young men to die by the scores, by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the 10,000s, by the 100,000s, and even by the millions. Over the top was the call. Whenever a new offensive was launched all along the line at a predetermined time, there would be the artillery barrage in which thousands and thousands of big cannons would let loose and rain death from above. This would last for several hours. Then the barrage would end, and then the whistles would blow. When the whistles blew, it was the commanders telling their young men, go over the top. Over the top means you rise out of the trenches and you charge. You charged across what was called no man's land. So no man's land was the area between the trenches. So for example, if we had over on this side, you had, let's just call this we'll call it the Allied trench. That was right there. And on this side, you had the German trench. Well, obviously, and forgive the writing, this is a little bit difficult. Obviously, in between, both sides had laid as many traps as possible. There would be barbed wire in layers on both sides. There would be mines all along the way that if you stepped on them, you would blow up. Both sides had targeted this area for artillery, and so this in-between land was called no man's land. So when you went over the top, you would come over and you would charge. You would attempt to get to the German trenches. Men would rise, they would rush, they would hit barbed wire, they would hit machine guns, we'll talk about those, they would hit artillery. On an offensive, it was not out of the realm of reason for 70% of the initial assault to die. 7 out of 10 men dying, and the rest would eventually, after they were utterly stunned, after they were suffering from trauma, after they were in actual battlefield shock, they would slink back to the trenches, and all would be for nothing. Far behind the lines, generals who were at no risk ordered them to charge again and again and again. You would think at some point the generals would realize, hey guys, we've tried this 10 times, it's never worked, why are we trying it 11th time? But there was just no creativity. Nothing changed except for the number of dead. There was no new thought. There was a few new ideas we're going to talk about, and many of them came from non-traditional sources, not the generals, but sometimes even from politicians. The general solution was basically to do the same thing over and over and over and over again. Technology had raced so far beyond the thinking of the generals. They were almost back in the days of the cavalry charge. You know, these generals who had been soldiers back in the 1860s, they asked themselves, well, what works? Well, if we all get on our horses and draw our swords and we charge, that's what we used to do back in the old days. And a bunch of generals would say, yeah, that sounds good, let's do it. And so they would send a bunch of young men and they would die. And they would say, well, now what? Well, if we charged a little harder this time. Remember, the French began the war with this overwhelming confidence in what they called élan, this battlefield spirit. And so they were convinced that, oh, this is going to do it. This is all we need to do. And it just was not successful. It was not going to work. And no matter how hard they try, this was not going to be a winning strategy. In 1915, there was another new development, this time in the South. Italy finally chose a side. For a while, Italy had been pledged to the Central Powers, but they'd never actually followed through on their agreement. And so Italy had been neutral. Italy entered the war, and it was not because of any noble aspiration of helping their brothers, or no, Italy entered the war because Italy saw an opportunity to take territory, specifically territory against their old enemy, Austria-Hungary. So they were originally linked to the Central Powers, but when they entered the war, they came in on the side of the Allies. Italy quickly launched an attack against Austria-Hungary in the south. Italy entered the war with visions of grandeur. They thought they were going to win. They thought that they were going to choose the right side. They thought they were going to overwhelm the Austrians. The Austrians by this time had been fighting for quite some time, and though they were not as good as the Germans, experience had made them much better. And the Italians came in fresh and enthusiastic and stupid. And so here the Italians, they come over largely through the Alps. These are Italian mountain troops summiting and then ideally attacking from a position of shock and surprise. The idea was the Austrians would never expect to be attacked from this angle. The Austrians, though, were not foolish people by any means. The mountainous terrain, the coming of winter, and the opposition, they ground the Italian offensive to a halt. So the Italians charge, they bring their men, and they discover they gain very little territory, and suddenly there's an entire line of Austrian Hungarians there, and they cannot penetrate. And so pretty quickly, it becomes a stalemate. Now, the Austrians were pushed. It was a genuinely difficult offensive to halt, but they called for reinforcements from Germany. It was enough. And so by 1915, now we have a new front, this Italian front, this southern front, and nobody is moving. And it's in harsh terrain. It's in mountains. Later on, Italy is going to suffer one of the most embarrassing defeats of the war. A defeat that will utterly devastate the high command of Italy, that will involve just a mass surrender, but that's coming years from now. And it's shocking in particular because of the reasons Italy joins the war. Italy is joining for the sake of what they believe territorial advance. It's about greed. Once again, there's no great philosophical reason for Italy to join. They just think this is a chance to make a quick buck, or in this case, quick land. The other change of 1915, we already seen the addition of the Italians, was the arrival of even newer technology. I know it's an evil, but war often spurs technological advance. And many of these advancements have civilian applications, but in their initial concern, they're instruments of death. And so 1915 becomes the year of new inventions. We see the arrival of heavy machine guns. Heavy machine guns had been invented earlier, but they had been flawed in many ways. They were prone to malfunction. They were too inconvenient to use, but heavy machine guns are perfected in many ways during this era, and they become standard issue weapons for battalions. So the average soldier was not walking around with a heavy machine gun. The average soldier was walking around with a rifle, but teams were set up, and so every so many men were equipped with both light machine guns and then heavy machine guns. The popular Lewis gun, which was an Allied machine gun, could fire 500 to 600 rounds per minute. So here is a Lewis gun right here. We can see quickly is how small it really is for its destructive power. It's the kind of gun that a two-man team could carry. In this case, the gun was so effective, it's being used as an anti-aircraft gun, which is why he's pointing in the air. But it has this large barrel. The barrel is actually surrounded by a cooling system, because when you're throwing 500 to 600 bullets down the barrel within a minute, the barrel will actually begin to glow and melt and sag. It required cooling. The Lewis gun solved this by wrapping the barrel in the necessary cooling equipment. You can see right here, this gentleman is holding another magazine. The bullets go on the circular thing that sits on the top of the gun, and so he might fire a couple hundred rounds, which would go through in 15-20 seconds. Then he swaps out. There is an entire ammo box filled with these magazines, and so one after another. Now, it was useful against aircraft, but against men, it was just tremendously deadly. So as you can imagine, trying to charge against a field, or in a field, and the other side with hundreds of these guns, just going back and forth, mowing all the men down. These guns were tremendously effective as battlefield instruments and tremendously deadly in how they accomplished their task. So this was a new invention that made the battlefield so much more dangerous. By 1915, both sides were now using poison gas. This created huge number of casualties, many of whom did not die immediately, many of whom were maimed for life. Gas masks became a necessity because there was lethal clouds floating all over the fields, ruining the land for years to come. Mustard gas, chlorine gas, any number of various gases. They did anything from blind to outright kill. It all depends on the concentration. It depends on how heavily the wind was blowing. The poison gas could be loaded in bombs, but usually it was loaded in artillery shells, so they'd be launched on both sides. At the very beginning, it was unexpected. These men were all blinded by a gas attack. Some would recover. Many would be blind for the rest of their lives. And so it was incredibly painful, incredibly destructive. Later on, it was banned by mutual agreement of governments all over the world. But early on, it was used pretty frequently by both sides, by both the Central Powers and the Allies. Aircraft were used as weapons of war for the first time during the First Battle of the Marne. They started as reconnaissance. So it was always a matter of trying to aim your artillery shells in the right location. So you would need a spotter, someone usually on the ground with binoculars that was looking to see where the shells were landing. And so he would radio back instructions, raise the elevation because we need to go farther, or whatever it would be. Somebody realized an airplane would be the perfect location to be able to spot artillery shells. So pretty soon both sides had airplanes flying over the battlefield, sending instructions back to the artillery, telling them how close or how far away they were from the enemy. Eventually, as these pilots are flying past each other, Germans and British and French, they began carrying pistols and they began shooting at each other. And this is not a particularly effective way of dealing with other pilots, but it was something. This eventually led to the mounting of machine guns on the airplane itself. Now, at first, the machine guns had a real problem, is you couldn't put the machine gun firing forward, or if you did, you had to put it way off to the side or way high because you couldn't take a chance of blowing off your own propeller, which was often mounted in the front of the aircraft. Eventually, there was the development of what's called the interrupter gear, and so basically it was tied to the trigger to make sure that the bullets were only fired through the gaps within the propeller, and that radically changed how you could fight in the air. This was the birth of what was called the fighter plane. Fighter planes were airplanes that were designed with one purpose, and that was to shoot down other airplanes. Other pilots didn't bring pistols, they brought grenades with them, and they would drop them over enemy lines. That was the birth of the bomber. And the bomber, that was an airplane that was built with the intent of dropping munitions on the other side. This was an early fighter plane, the German Fokker E-1. You can see right here, this is the machine gun. And you'll notice it sits on where the propeller would go. It has this interrupter gear. It basically fires bullets in between this part and this part. It does not fire while the blade is going by. Now, these airplanes were, by our standards, slow and they were extremely dangerous to fly. Even without people shooting you, they frequently broke apart, maintenance issues, and many men died. But they did represent a massive increase in performance for their day. I mean, we're only 10 years away from the Wright brothers inventing the airplane, and now we've got these monowing fighters that are reasonably acrobatic and reasonably powerful for what the world had been. And so this is also the birth of what was called dogfighting. Dogfighting is when fighter planes would fight each other. It's the closest thing in this modern age to the knights of old who charge each other in a joust in the fields of battle. In addition to the fighter plane, you also had bombers. This is a British Handley Page bomber, an early one. You can see how large it is, comparatively speaking. There are 2 engines, large wingspan. The amount of pounds of bombs it could drop was fairly limited, but it was something. It could actually drop bombs on the other side, whether that was men on the battlefield, whether that was important railway positions, whether that was even ships themselves, although that was mainly to come later. This was a new experience. So we had a British Handley Page bomber. Aviation developed rapidly with the war. Not only did you have fighter planes and bombers, you also had balloons, blimps, and zeppelins. People realized that if you're on the ground, the air is an excellent place to be because from the air you have the advantage of height, you have the advantage of vision, you have the ability to rain down death from above. So by the end of the war, the speed, the maneuverability, and the firepower had increased exponentially. Fighters at the end of World War I were literally hundreds of times faster, more maneuverable, more armored, more armamented. They had bigger guns than those at the beginning of the war. These pilots became Knights of the Sky. The aces, those who had shot down 5 enemy planes or more, became famous. They were known all over Germany. They were known all over France. They were known all over England. If you were an ace, you could walk into any bar in Europe and people would buy you a drink, and women threw themselves at the feet of these men. The downside is the vast majority of aces were killed in combat, but it was quite a career for those who were able to pull it off. To give you an idea of just the technological change, this is a Zeppelin. The Zeppelins were effective because earlier in the war, they were able to fly higher than any fighters could travel, and they were able to carry large bomb capacity. So at the very beginning, Zeppelins could fly over enemy positions with no threat and drop bombs and then slowly go home. That changed pretty quickly. The airplanes were able to fly up that high, and a Zeppelin is a big target, a big explosive target. And very quickly, Zeppelins were reduced to backline duty because it was just too dangerous. It was too easy for fighter pilots to fly up there to launch a stream of bullets into the sacks that were often either filled with helium if you were lucky, but often with hydrogen, which was explosive, in which case everyone on board would die. This is a Zeppelin that is actually flying over a modern battleship. This represented the peak of military power in 1915. At sea, the German fleet was bottled up in harbor. There's a bit of irony there. Remember, one of the key contributing factors of World War I was this naval arms race, as both the Germans and the English were competing with each other to see who could build the biggest, most powerful fleet and the most powerful ships. Well, Germany had spent millions and millions of dollars creating this fleet from scratch, and the British had spent millions and millions of dollars creating a fleet that could destroy the Germans. And you would think, with all the expenditure and all the work that had been done, the Germans would be anxious to launch this battle on the sea to prove their worth. Well, when push came to shove, the Germans were trapped in their harbor. The British fleet was too powerful, was essentially sitting right outside waiting for them to come out. And so for most of 1914, most of 1915, the German fleet did almost nothing. Instead, Germany put their hope into a new development. It's something that had been invented years early, but now had turned into an actual weapon, and that was the submarine. In Germany, they were called Unterseeboots, or as we know them, U-boats. U-boats were just an abbreviation. So these German U-boats began to prey upon merchant shipping, and merchant shipping, that is just cargo ships going back and forth. So the Germans, they conceived of this idea that they wanted to starve the British and French. So without goods and supplies coming from the United States, the Allies, they believed, would die. And there's truth in that. By this time, the United States, 1915, was not on anyone's side. It was not on the Central Power side. It was not on the Triple Entente side. It was its own nation. It was neutral. But the Americans were more than happy to sell to anyone who would buy their goods. The Americans would sell to the Allies. The Americans would sell to the Central Powers. But there was a problem. Who controlled the seas? Well, the Allies did. So Germany essentially made a deal. America, you don't sail to deliver goods to Germany, and in return, we'll buy everything for full price. The Americans essentially said, works for us as long as we get paid. And so the Americans began supplying a lot of the necessary goods, food and clothing and all these things, to the British and to the French, and even some of the military goods. Ammunition and weapons are being made in America. And you might say, well, doesn't that violate neutrality? Doesn't it mean that they're choosing a side? Kind of yes, kind of no. But regardless, America is supplying all these goods to the Allied side, and the Germans realize we've got to stop the flow of goods, because so long as Germany and France are getting these goods, they're not going to feel the real pain of war. They can go on forever. So in 1915, Germany declared a blockade. A blockade is when ships gather and deny the other side the ability to enter or to leave harbor. Now, Germany was walking a dangerous tightrope. Germany was trying to blockade England and blockade France without offending America. So long as America was out of the war, that was to Germany's advantage, because by 1915, American opinion was split. There were a lot of people in America who thought Germany was in the right and wanted Germany to win, but the majority of America wanted the Allies to win. So, with that in mind, Germany thought as long as America stays out of the war, that's our best case scenario. In May of 1915, Germany made a major mistake. They sunk the passenger liner Lusitania, which was bound from New York to England. The Lusitania was primarily a passenger liner. It was carrying 1,000 people on this journey from America to England. For the first time, America started talking about war. Germany, a U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania. It sunk and 1,000 people died, including 100 American citizens. The Germans claimed that the Lusitania was secretly carrying munitions, which is ammunition, for the Allied war cause. And they said because of this, that made the Lusitania a rightful target, and it was the British fault for putting these kinds of weapons on a passenger ship. By the way, the Germans were right. It didn't matter. The British denied it. The Americans denied it. And so in American public opinion, this was a major issue. May of 1915, American public opinion makes a pretty major change. Now, the average American starts looking at Germany as the enemy. The average American starts cheering for the Allied side. And this was a major problem. In response, Germany essentially ends the U-boat threat for some time. This is the Lusitania. It was a large passenger ship. This was before it was sunk. And it was primarily for passengers. It was a luxury liner before the war began, but it was carrying some munitions. But once again, it doesn't matter. It was public perception was the most important thing. As I said, for a while, the Germans stopped unrestricted submarine warfare. They declared that any ship that was flying the American flag was off limits and don't sink them. They could not afford to offend the Americans. America was complicated. As long as Germany could keep America out of the war, it was going to be helpful. Now, later on, Germany is going to fail spectacularly in this. We'll talk about that later on. But for the time being, their goal, just don't tick the Americans off. So long as America's on the sideline, that was good for Germany. That was going to mean Britain and France were going to need to do this on their own. The German fleet. The German fleet did attempt to break out of harbor in 1916, and the result was the most important naval battle of World War I, the Battle of Jutland. At Jutland, a number of British battle cruisers exploded, but the English held the German fleet back. So let me explain what I mean by that. So at the Battle of Jutland, the English fleet was divided into two parts. There were the scouting battle cruiser force. A battle cruiser was a large ship that had very large guns, that was very fast, and had very weak armor. A battle cruiser was never designed to fight big ships. The reason you built battle cruisers was they were supposed to sail out on the seas and hunt down merchant vessels. That's what they were. They were supposed to be lone wolves. But both sides were not properly using their battle cruisers. Both the English and the Germans considered them part of the main battle fleet. So in England divided into two. You had this fast battle cruiser fleet that was being led by Admiral David Beatty. And then you had the main battleship fleet that was led by Admiral John Jellicoe. The English battleship fleet was the most powerful fleet in the world. It was massive. It was modern. It could punch. It could take a punch. It was fast. It was everything you could want. If the German fleet was able to, if the English battleship fleet led by Jellicoe could catch up to the German fleet, it was likely that they could destroy the German fleet. And if that was the case, then the English could potentially start making military landings anywhere on the north coast of Germany. Germany would have to open up any number of new fronts to protect themselves. This was a big deal. So the English battle fleet is divided into two. The battleship fleet, the main fleet, led by Admiral John Jellicoe, he was in supreme command, and then the battle cruiser fleet led by David Beatty. Now, David Beatty was what we would consider Hollywood. He was a good-looking man, famous, had affairs with a number of women, well-known in society. He always made sure that everything he did was covered by reporters. England thought David Beatty was the best. David Beatty was a man of tremendous ego and limited skill, and who made some tremendous mistakes that are greatly going to cost the English. So Beatty, so in 1916, the Battle of Jutland, the German fleet decides it's time to sail out. They've got to do something. So they sail out. They think that they're going in disguise. The British had actually cracked codes, knew they were coming, so they were on the patrol. The instructions were clear. If Beatty were to find the German fleet, he was to let Jellicoe know and turn around and join up with Jellicoe, and together they would crush the Germans. Simple instructions. Well, Beatty ends up sighting the German fleet, or at least part of the German fleet. Beatty gives a number of confusing instructions. He radios Jellicoe, but does so poorly, doesn't give necessary information, does it late. An absolute failure on his part. He leads his ships into battle, but remember, his ships were battle cruisers. They weren't intended to engage other main battle ships like the Germans had. The Germans had just designed better ships. He gave conflicting instructions to his own ships. He was using an outdated system of communication, and so as he joins the fight, as Beatty charges in, his ship exploding. This is the HMS Queen Mary, one of Beatty's battle cruisers. She takes a hit, probably to the main magazine, and explodes. 1,000 men gone in a moment. And so Beatty is getting rolled. And so he realizes he's dealing with the entire German fleet. He turns and he begins running back toward Admiral Jellicoe's main battle fleet, which is what he probably should have done at the beginning. And this draws the German fleet in. Jellicoe is charging hard. He's on his way. The Germans do realize what's happening, so the Germans turn and try running back to England. Some of the German ships are in range of Jellicoe's guns, and they get pounded. Eventually, like the rest of World War I, the Battle of Jutland ends in a draw. The German fleet is able to escape back to their home harbor before they are destroyed. The English fleet has to return back home, where they're now missing a number of ships because they blew up. The British claim victory because they say we've held the German fleet within their harbor, and they're correct. The Germans claim victory because they say we blew up a bunch of British ships, and they were correct. In the end, it was just indecisive. It meant nothing. The unfortunate result is, for reasons that have everything to do with the media and their inability to understand what they're talking about, Admiral David Beatty is presented as a hero. Admiral John Jellicoe is presented as one who is nervous and cautious and costing England the victory. Jellicoe had done exactly right, done exactly what he was supposed to do, had preserved his fleet, preserved his nation. Beatty was a failure, but there is no justice in the world, and so Beatty is glorified, and eventually he's promoted. Britain owed a debt to the men who had prepared them for this moment. Jackie Fisher, who had been the leader of the British Navy, is called the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was Jackie Fisher was the first Sea Lord. Winston Churchill was a politician who had been assigned essentially responsibility for the Admiralty, which is the British High Command for their Navy. And together, these men had produced this tremendous battle fleet. And this British fleet had been prepared for the war. They were ensuring the survival of England. They locked down the German fleet. So long as England continued to control the oceans, they could continue the war. That was a big deal. So by 1915, it was a stalemate on land. 1916, it was a stalemate on the seas. Time and time again, each side launched assaults. They launched battles. We're not even dealing with the name of those battles. They're pointless. They accomplished nothing other than death and destruction. There was an element of discouragement and of pessimism that was spreading along the battlefield. World War I had not been a quick and easy war. World War I was beginning to really impact the economic performance. Not beginning. It was actually having impact on the livelihood of the people. They were eating less food. Diseases were spreading. 1915 and 1916 were just miserable years. And so tomorrow we'll pick up, continue the development of the war, continue looking at its pointless nature and the destruction that it reaped, and then eventually we'll see some of the changes that happen. So trust that you are being able to follow along. If you have any questions, anything you want me specifically to mention or to address, please feel free to email me. Just to remind you is that when we do regather, we will take quizzes and tests on all this material, so I trust that you are prepared for it. So, hope this is helpful. Enjoy the rest of your day.